and welcome everyone. Let me know if you can hear us and see us loud and clear in the chat. If someone can drop a note saying everybody can hear us, that would be great. Jared, can you hear me?
I could hear you.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me? I heard an okay from Pragya, so that was either perfectly
Yes.
timed or she could hear me.
Yeah, I can see in the chat everybody says good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the amazing session that a lot of you have been signed up for, and a lot of people, us have been waiting eagerly for, the annual planning session for specifically for RevOps team. And I'm your co-host, host, whatever you want to call, Pragya Mishra. I'm new at RevGenius. I'm the head of marketing, and bringing my non-B2B experience to this session. Have a big history in B2C brands and consumer brands. We have with us Molly, who's the person running the show, the know-it-all. Molly, over to you.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm joking because it's like 'tis the season for annual planning, right? I'm sure everybody on this call, it's timely and relevant, and we're all being asked to start putting our roadmaps in place and kind of figure out what 2024 looks like. So excited to be here. For those who don't know me, Molly Bodensteiner, I have been in operations. I like to say RevOps before it was RevOps for the last 13 plus years, and I'm on my fifth company running a revenue operations organization. So really excited to be here, share perspective. One of the asks that I have for the audience is like, plug your questions in, right? So much of what we're doing is situational to our business, and so well, experience and perspective are great. Being able to get those specific questions answered is what we want to be able to provide on the session today. Jared, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, I'm Jared. I'm the luckiest person on this stage because I was invited with these two powerhouses, Molly and Pragya. I met Molly, and first off, I want to shout out our sponsors who very much are aligned with strategic planning and annual planning. Both Deal Hub, which automates your quoting process, helps teams close faster, as well as Apparatus, who I had an awesome chance to meet in person at SaaStr. They work with growing companies to optimize their sales and marketing process, drive business results. The agency aspect. I met Molly originally at Syncery, which we now both advise. And what's so amazing about Molly, everything, but she's really worked with companies like so forward thinking on their RevOps, like building new playbooks as it's going. And so hearing her today is going to be awesome. And I'm so amped. What a great time. It's September 27th. Who in here has created their plan for 2024 already? You could put a put a 1 if you have not in the chat, and a 2 if you have, because if I wrote one, Calvin hasn't. Oh, good. We have Pragya has.
Yeah, one of the
Pragya
things
has not
that's
anymore.
Two-ish, 1.5.
One, it's not complete. I mean, I don't want to ask who has Q4 plan. That could go off the rails for many reasons. But
we haven't even planned next month.
We'll keep it safe with 2024. And this is a big topic in all of GTM, right? But really excited to have Molly here. I'm talking way too much here, Molly. Like let's dive right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're setting goals. Where the fuck do we start? Just kidding. What are some of the best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, when we talk specifically for revenue operations, we've got to remember there's such a collaborative aspect that goes through this, right? As much as we, talk about our silos, right? If you're setting goals in a silo, right, you're continuing to foster that non-collaborative, non-joined look. So when I think about goals, one of the main things here is ultimately you've got a corporate goal, right? You know where you're trying to go as a company, and you should be then cascading down from that, right? So thinking about what are the initiatives and then the cross-functional actions that you're ultimately trying to achieve that are going to move those initiatives to drive that corporate goal. And really making sure those types of things are top of mind as I'm setting goals for, not I'm, but the team is setting, our revenue operations goals and setting that roadmap, right? There's goals, but there's also the roadmap of how you're planning on getting to those goals. So that alignment across the business is key. Knowing RevOps is super cross-functional, and pending whether you're running like a business partner relationship where you have like functional alignment, or you're a little bit more broad in scope based on your resourcing, it's really important that the same way like finance takes a tops down and a bottoms up to getting to the number, you're doing kind of the same thing with your roadmap. I'm in an interesting industry right now where we actually start our fiscal year in August. So we've done our planning. So we're just kind of coming out of the planning cycle. So as we're having these conversations, I feel like I'm ahead of the game because I'm not at like that Christmas crunch. But one of the things that I like to start with my team is like, I ask my team to outline, what do they think needs to get done based on like where our goals are. Right? What is the business trying to do, and having that transparency and the why behind it, and what needs to go into that. And then I take a pass at like the tops down approach of it, of like, what am I seeing the need for when I think about capacity, when I think about resourcing, when I think about, budgeting that would ultimately need to go in there, and try to blend that together, right? If we talk about we're launching a new product, right? Like that's how we're planning on growing revenue by X. These are the assumptions that we've made around that. Like, what support does RevOps need to play in that? What does that look like based on the time period of when we expect to go to market, when we expect to really start to see results? And how do you reverse engineer into that and like start to build the plan around that and the goals around that? I think is really important. The one thing on this is like, make sure you're aligning with your goals too, right? So sitting down, SteerCo is like, I think something that businesses talk about doing a lot, especially in go-to-market, but don't really run well, of like really making sure there's alignment. Revenue operations, we got to remember, and I know I'm talking a lot right now, and I'll shut up after this and see if there's questions or feedback, but we're a support function, right? As we're a strategic support function. Like at the end of the day, like my team knows, I call them like, we're the dream makers, right? When the business has an idea, we're ultimately the ones who are like making the dream come true, and delivering it across the business. And so one of the things like we have to remember in that is like, do we have the right resources? Do we have the right support? Like, are we fully aligned? And one of the things that like I think is so important when it comes to like the SteerCo concept is like, sales, marketing, CS, finance, if they're not aligned, you're set up for failure off the bat. So being able to put everything to the table and saying like, let's make sure we have priorities aligned, right? Because marketing is going to come with their agenda, sales is going to come with their agenda, and like they might not realize how codependent they are on each other and like on the byproduct of their work to hit their goals, right? If sales says we need this, and marketing's like, yeah, I hear you. You need to this. You're not going to get this unless I have these dollars to invest in this, to build the pipeline, to build the funnel, to make this happen, are the conversations that I think we tend to miss. And so really pushing on those. Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
I support is obvious, but I think you're so much more than that. Like you're an enabler. Like you are a growth. Because otherwise both people would be going 100 miles per hour, assuming they were giving it their all, into a wall.
Right. Oh yeah. And that's where I talk about like, we're strategic, it's strategic support.
Both
function,
people
right?
are sales and marketing in my example, if you could have
yeah.
together.
Oh yeah. I mean, you're the person who sees if the car's going to crash before it crashes, because you're feeling that, right? And you have that perspective because you have such a collective view around it. But at the end of the day, like our role is to support the business, right? And like drive the business and help advise and guide and like implement there. And I think that's where though, like sometimes that perspective like doesn't always get to the table. And that's where, even in running a RevOps team, being mindful of like not being myopic to like what the individual contributors or the functional leaders on my team are recommending. And that's where like I think it's so important to get that level of perspective, because there's things that I might be missing.
This is a good segue to what Alex just put in. Like, so Alex said strategic support function. That really resonated with them. One thing they're currently dealing with is separating strategy and execution within the team.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, I deal with that every day, right? This is the fifth company that I've ran revenue operations on. And like, even having difference between being a team of 1, having a team of 10, having a team of 50, right? There's still that challenge of, separating like what is operational strategy, business strategy, and what is like execution and tactic, and like getting that right blend of those. I don't know that anyone in a revenue operations like leadership role is going to say like, I only do strategy, right? I think that if that's the mindset you go into, and like that's your view as a leader and being in this practice, I think you're not going to be successful, because so much of like the ability to build strong operational strategy is understanding what goes into executing that strategy, which is the tactics, and being able to be a good steward of resources, making the right investments, and like building operational efficiency is a tactical. It's tactical, right? It really is. Like if you're looking at process optimization, there's such a level of, and it's tactics, not a bad word, right? I think that's the thing that people hear and they're like, I don't want to be tactical. I don't want to be tactical. Tactical is what drives improvement, right? And understanding that is what ultimately starts to drive strategy. And like, that's one of the things like I would love to pivot in this like taboo of like revenue operations not getting a seat at the table and not being viewed as like strategic because they're tactical. Like we've got to change that narrative. Like it's not a bad thing. Like tactical is what moves the business forward, right? Like being able to define a strategy, know what goes into the strategy, and like execute against that is such a value add to an organization, and really is the driver. And I'm sorry I'm on a soapbox right now, but like that's what builds it, right?
I'm just thinking about revenue stop operations. Prague is too.
Yeah, we heard that one before. But we have another question actually from Alex that says, do you think there's a certain ratio that works better for your current industry? I've heard output strategy as a general rule of thumb.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends, ultimately, right? So like where you have to get is like, you've got to know where you're trying to go, right? You've got to have goals, you've got to have objectives, you've got to have, a roadmap. Because if you don't have those things, like you start getting into like the just do, and you're doing without like, you're not sure if you're doing the right things, right? You've got to know that you're doing the right things. Like let's call that like number one. Make sure you're executing on things that go towards plan. And like that's really, what it becomes. And like when you think about, how you're executing or what you're executing on, or like what's going into the plan, like having that right concept of prioritization and like shaping the strategy is, I think, super key. Like a couple of the things that like I think about is like, there's the fun pyramid of like, don't eat too much sugar, right? If you eat sugar, you're not going to be healthy. Like balance like your food pyramid. I think that same concept kind of goes into like when I'm building a roadmap for like revenue operations, or my team's building a roadmap, is like, what's that base, right? That base is your foundation. Like if you're building a house and you don't have a foundation or a solid foundation, like things are always going to be wobbly. And the challenge is that like the business wants to start at the top of the pyramid, which is like, how do we, optimize, right? How do we optimize for performance? And that, well, can't really optimize what you don't have baseline for. So when you think about like how you're prioritizing and like what goes where, you've got to have the foundation. The next step on that is like, how do you make sure you're streamlining business as usual? How do you make sure you're investing in scale and making sure that you are, looking at how your time is spent and like the ROI that you're getting based on the outcomes that you're doing? Do you need to invest in automation? Like if you're doing these repeat tasks all the time, how do you improve this? The next piece is like, how do you start to drive then efficiency for your stakeholders, right? So like making sure that they have the right information that they need. We have invested in the foundation. We've got our core processes. We've got the right data. We're surfacing up those insights so that they can make the best decisions. And then how do we take that to start testing and optimizing results and making sure like we're running playbooks, we're gathering that data and like truly being able to transform the business. And so part of that is like being able to articulate those things back when you look at like a roadmap and why you're doing these things. Because if I sit and say like, hey, we need to invest in, a deduping type tool, right? Like, and this is like $1 investment that we need to make. Like that's not the big sexy thing that like the CFO wants to hear, right? Or the CEO wants to hear. And like being able to make that like business case is like where the ROI is on that for the business. Like how does that foundation, how does that streamline, how does that optimize becomes really important.
Especially because you mentioned budgets now. Do you have to fight for budget? Like, how do you see getting the right sign off, and what kind of stakeholders do you have to actually align the person responsible for the marketing budget, sales budget before you go to the CFO, or how do you see that?
Yeah, so budgets are weird, right? And I think like one of the things, and it depends on like where you sit in the organization. Like I've had one of my red flag, right, is like if when I'm interviewing or talking to a job, like, do I have a budget? Right? Like, and if you have a conversation with a company and they're like, oh yeah, no, RevOps, doesn't have a budget, you just, make a business case and ask, like, red flag. Like that does not usually work out in your favor because that's saying that they don't have allocated dollars set up for like likely what you're going to need, and you're going to need to like really fight hard to make cases, and like things are going to delay, like you don't have the right jurisdiction over your plan. So make sure you are trying to advocate for a budget, especially if you own like the tech and tooling specifically. Spend the time and map out like your dollar plan, right? One of the things that I do, and everyone knows this, like if you're using a CRM, there's a cost per license, right? You have a hiring plan. Make sure you have that cascaded throughout the year so you know what that spend's going to be. You can forecast, you can project against that. Do that for all your tech and tooling. So like when renewals come up, things come up, like it's really clear, and you're not going back to procurement and they're like, why are we spending $10,000 more, $50,000 more? Well, like it's forecasted, it's planned, it's there. We're hiring more people, which means we're spending more on other things to support them. But the other piece of that is like, make sure you can identify like where additional tech investment might need to be made, and like what that ROI looks like by doing so. Additionally is headcount. One of the things that I do within my roadmaps is I put in place like here's the roles and responsibilities, here's the capacity of the team today. If you tell me that we're going to do X, Y, and Z, we either need to make a decision of what isn't going to get done from the current capacity, or we need to understand like what are the roles that we need to be able to fill. And there's the concept of what are like, do we have skill set gaps, right? Like if we're saying we need to be able to do, we need to stand up a data warehouse, I might not have like the resources to support that. So like what's the investment from people too? And like having the ability to have the foresight to be able to articulate those needs earlier on is so much more proactive than going back and being like, we're at capacity, my team can't take anything more. And it becomes this like scramble because you didn't stop and like spend the time really like planning out the future needs.
A couple questions came in, and what do you think about prioritizing initiatives across the GTM teams that might be competing for time, resources, and then adding to the above on a small team? And this wasn't you too long ago, although you were on a very big team more recently. How do you balance supporting execution across GTM, sales, marketing, et cetera, while still trying to take a step back and plan for the future, looking for areas of efficiency, investing for scale, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you think about prioritizing initiatives across the go-to-market team, because again, so RevOps, I'm going to keep saying it, we're a shared resource, right? We are a shared service in the company. Even though pending how you're structured, you might have functional resources, right? Like marketing ops, sales ops that have more of like that business partner relationship. Underneath that, generally, you've got an additional layer of shared resources, which is like your systems team, right? Your data team. Like there's got to be a level of like prioritization across those resources, right? And how they're functioning. And again, it goes back to like, you can't have those silos. So making sure as you have those roadmaps in place, like you understand priority of those initiatives. You shouldn't have like, hey, here's my marketing ops roadmap, here's my sales ops roadmap, here's my CS ops roadmap, and them be contradicting each other. I think about this the great example I have, and I'm sure I won't soapbox on OKRs because we'd be here for a month, but like the worst thing for me as a RevOps person is I get everyone's like OKRs and like try to plan my OKRs, and I'm like, did you guys even talk to each other? Like, you are contradicting what you're even trying to do as a business. And like that to me is like that red flag that like we're not aligned as a company. So first step is like, make sure your actual like cross-functional, actions are aligned, and then start to cascade down from that, because that's going to be like, I'm going to say like the captain obvious approach of this, right? Like, all right, sales, you're trying to generate more revenue from this new product that we're launching. You're trying to tell me that this playbook for how you're going to sell is more important than like generating demand, right? Like, you've got to have like those kind of trade-offs from the resources of like when we should be making the investment and the initiatives and like the cascade, and like that's like the project plan, right? And just getting people aligned around that, I think, is really important. And you're gonna fight for what your team needs, and like there's always going to be that friction between specifically sales, marketing, but now as we think about growth, like CS is coming hot to the table too, which just adds one more person and one more dynamic here that you've got to represent and support. But I think it's getting them to sign off and align on things that's like so key. And like that's where I think RevOps can be a really good driver and like facilitator in that, and like forcing function for those decisions when done well.
And maybe I can just drop in a line that I think one of the things that I loved was in one of the companies I worked for, we used to have a shared OKRs sheet. So you could actually see everybody else's OKRs and at any point of time. And that really helps put things in perspective and what's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And like to being the small team piece too, like that's the other thing is like you have to be able to champion your capacity, right? And like the worst thing you can do being a team of one is come to the table and say like, I don't have time for this, I can't do this. Like, and it's a reactive versus coming to the table and saying like, hey, here's what I hear that we need. Here's what I believe is the priority that we should do these things. This is based on the resources that I have today and the capacity that I have and like where we're at, the realistic like timing that can be done. Are we aligned on this? And like use that to drive the discussion. And like, because by doing that, you're setting the expectation, right? Versus letting your stakeholders set the expectation. But then it's their job to say like, if this doesn't meet what we need to then like have a realistic conversation about either the give or the take or the investment that gets made. But if you come into those conversations, and this is just based on experience, right? Like I'm underwater, I'm drowning, I'm, like flailing, and I'm like, somebody help me. You're not probably going to get the right type of help that you're asking for because they don't necessarily understand what you need. And you're probably in a position you're not prepared to articulate it. So be prepared to articulate it, take the time and space to think through it, and really be the driver of that conversation versus like being the byproduct of getting the result based on the decisions that people who don't understand it are probably going to make.
Molly, I think your words are spitting empathy to Alex here, who says this is exactly what they needed.
I know. I feel like I just need to give Alex a hug over here.
No, that I mean, I have a personal question to ask. But budgets are down 33% next year, but revenue's got to be up 33%. How do you do it? And tech budgets, I mean, and probably budgets across the board for hiring too.
Oh yeah, I mean, getting hit with just like, tighter ROI, tighter expectation. Like you've got to set the expectations, right? And like this is where it's like you have a plan, you've got to work the plan, but you've got to also look at like pacing and performance, right? And I think those are the things that are so key in here. And this has been one of like the peeves that I've had generally with some like company planning, right? So just to your point, we're cutting budget, we're going to do more. Okay, great. What assumptions did you make to tell us how we're going to get there? Right? Like let's pull back the covers and like understand like what assumptions we're making. And like you've got to have that transparency level at the right level, like the right places in the organization. Not saying like you're going to be fully transparent all the way down because you might not be able to do that, but like you're obviously putting bets somewhere in your planning, in your budgeting. Like, you have to be prepared to communicate those, right? And like pressure test those, and like have those conversations around like, are we pacing against this? Are we not, right? Like, and what are the different like situational bets we're going? If I, as an ops leader, don't have that understanding, I'm going to be doing the wrong things all day long, because I've got to know where I need to flex, where I need to be able to scale, where I need to be able to pivot where it makes sense, and like stay on top of those things.
And maybe this is a great segue for the second section that we discussed, which is how do you then leverage the data that you have inside your business to actually help you with the planning?
Yeah, absolutely. So like, I go back to baselines, right? One of the things, like, you got to start with a base. Like, even if you're a 2-year-old business, you've got some level of baseline that you're going in. Like, where do you stand in the present? What does this look like, right? Like, what are the factors that go into this? And then how did you get to where you're trying to go to? So that goes back to like, what are the assumptions we're making? What are the either investments or the bets that we're hedging on? And like, beyond just the target number, like, what are the goals for the business that went into this? Anyone who's worked with like an FP&A team, who's generally like the team that's running the strategy, I think they're just like all super geniuses and, love spreadsheets that they'll share with you and be like, yeah, here's how we figured it out. And you're like, I have no idea what's going on in these formulas. So spend the time though, like, to make sure like there's a really good overview of like what the planning process was, what went into it, again, what the assumptions are, and what are the different scenarios, right? Generally, you're not building a plan off of like one thing. You've got different scenarios that are coming into this, and like those levers, because by understanding those, like, when I think about like, okay, if the business is trying to do this, here are the 10 things that I can do to like impact, and how do I prioritize those things, and what needs to go into like when that value has to be recognized. The other big thing, like, I think a lot about with annual planning and like, is that I think a lot of times people think like a salesperson is going to solve the problem, right? Like, bodies produce results. More quota, right? Like more that, like, go ahead.
I've heard this as the biggest myth debunked, from fractional revenue leaders to full-time. Fractional are a little easier, like more free flowing with this because they're hired to fix this. But RevOps leaders, etc., that's like the top thing. You can't just throw bodies at it.
Right. I mean, and I'll even push on that with like, it's not even just a quota carrying body, right? Like, if I'm looking at this and I say, okay, if I have a great operations manager and I need, they're going to move down a manager track and we're going to bring, a specialist in under them, I'm not getting 2x the output by hiring that, right? Like, that's not how the math works, right? Another body doesn't equal like double the results, right? It equals a different type of result and different type of scale, and there should be more productivity, but it's not a 1-for-1. When you think about like a sales rep, you've got to factor in, ramp. You've got to factor in, all of those like different components that ultimately go into like how they're hitting their quota, their target. It's not just like a plug and play. Bob and Jim aren't necessarily the same. Territory factors come into things as well. And so it's just like, another body doesn't equal results. And I think sometimes, like, if you really look at like the root cause of what you're trying to solve, is like, do we have a productivity problem with our sales team? Do we have a product understanding gap with our sales team? Like, maybe we have the right number of salespeople, but we have an efficiency problem on how we sell. We don't have a consistent methodology. We don't have like the right level of enablement. We don't have the right understanding of like the product, and we need an SC to come in and help improve the velocity behind this. Like, taking and like really having that broader scale of like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve with this, and like, are we trying to solve it the right way? Because the other thing that I see companies do is they're like, okay, we're going to come in, we've got this big territory, Bob's crushing it, let's break his territory in half. You think Bob's going to continue to perform the same way and get the same output, or when he has less market share? Probably not, right? Unless like you're changing something in the strategy. So I think Like those types of like, again, I'm like Captain Obvious, but like people who are super close to it maybe don't see it as much, but being able to bring like that perspective in, which goes into like, what assumptions are you making with the plan? What decisions are you doing? And like truly understanding how they got to where they're getting to is so critical for being able to like plan as an ops leader.
You're not even talking about the downstream optics. If you're a unicorn like company and you do some of these cuts, and I've seen it, names will be withstanding, and you're wrong, you cut their territory and a whole exodus of people are leaving, one thing to the next this is now hitting your whole team, your whole PR, your whole everything.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you think about, I mean, we haven't even talked about
not
like
talked enough, right? Like yeah, you
quota setting, right? Like
yeah.
And that's one of the things, like you build your capacity model, but like if you can't actually, I mean, as a sales rep, this was one of the big things, like when I worked in sales ops, like we spent time on is like, how did we get to your quota, right? Like let's reverse engineer this so you understand how we got to this number. Because if you've got reps that aren't bought in to what you're asking them to do and they don't feel like they have a plan to get there, you're setting them up for failure before you're even starting. And like it's the same thing for ops, right? If you're telling me I've got to do all these things, but like I don't know how you got to where I need to get to and like what your logic behind it is, and you're expecting me to like just do it, like I'm not going to be bought in. I'm not going to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I'm probably going to do things in the wrong way.
And I can maybe go back to a question that Paul asked a while ago and ties beautifully to this. He says, how do you keep the team focused on OKRs while executing the plan? Been a part of too many annual planning sessions where we establish objectives and actions, but measurement against key metrics indicators never really happen.
Yeah, this goes back to like my love of OKRs. Like, I mean, if anyone here has like worked at a company that they've like been like, oh, we did OKRs so great and like it felt right, like I'd love to buy you coffee and like talk about that, because like I have not, and I haven't, right? I'm just going to be honest with you, and like it's something that like, you know, my team looks at OKRs, we, you know, okay, great. Yeah, this makes sense. Like we're going to plan against it. But like when I think about, again, back to like the do now, do next, delegate and delete, like I feel like the OKRs always are kind of in that, like that, you know, yeah, like probably in like by the end of the quarter, they like are obsolete in some regard, or they're just not really the big thing that we really needed to do. And I think that again goes back to the planning. It goes back to like, you know, having that right alignment and the right coordination of things, and the mindset around it. I think OKRs just start to become this like business exercise that you're just like expected to do, and it's like this rinse and repeat. And you know, it's like it's not really, to me, sometimes like what the value add is, in terms of like what's my go-to to track goals. Like that goes back to like my roadmap, right? And having a clear roadmap, a scorecard against that, and like how my team is like impacting and driving results and performance based on what we're delivering. And when I look at that, I'm looking at more consistency versus like where I see OKRs are generally, you know, they're important. Like quarterly goals are important. And not to say like OKRs aren't valuable. I think it's more of like the way we structure OKRs that are less valuable in my mind, right? Especially like the KR and the measurement around them just still doesn't feel as intuitive. And I wish I had like this great other answer, and like maybe someday I'll have an epiphany around it. But like when I get, you know, a CEO is like, how are you going to measure this? What's the formula for measurement of like this goal that you're doing? And it's like, you've got to be able to measure it this way. It's like, no, you don't, that's not how it works, right? Like that's not how it works from like the operational lens. Like, you know, yes, we're trying to quantify efficiency, but like sometimes that doesn't happen in a quarter, right? Like, so what we're doing today, we might not have results for tomorrow.
Oh man, as a founder, this hits hard. Like the part of OKRs that's difficult is the buy-in and the structure of it. The idea of having quarterly goals theoretically is a great thing. right, Molly? Would you say?
Yeah, you 100% should have quarterly goals. Man, like on my team, right? We try to have weekly goals that we're looking to achieve, that we're moving the needle on.
How do you keep the whole team focused? And maybe it's, yeah, it needs to be some sort of structure, some sort of goal. And when I say the whole team, sales, marketing, CS buying in with you all, not just your team.
Yeah, and that's where I think, like, again, coming into like what is steering, having that go to market scorecard, right? Like that's what I like to use to like decide what we're doing, running a weekly go to market sync where we have a consistent scorecard that we're measuring against. Generally, we have different agendas each week of like, we're not looking at revenue numbers every single week, right? You're looking at pipeline at different times. You're looking at like CX performance pending your industry, right? You're looking at different key things based on seasonality, but you've got this like these core KPIs that you're trying to hit, right? Which should tie to your plan. And you're using that meeting to understand like what's happening in the business and like where should we all align? We should spend our time, energy, and effort seeing where we can make moves and move the needle. And that's where you're building like that accountability, that alignment, that buy-in, and then having that next touch point to be able to follow up and say, did it work? Did it not? Like we're going to put together, this working group, and we're going to action on things quickly. We're aligned. Let's see what we can shift. Don't do it quarterly, right? Like quarterly business reviews are retroactive. Start having more proactive and looking at some of those leading indicators early on and seeing what you can adjust.
Molly, what are some of the KPI examples that you've seen in working with everybody that you have for RevOps teams?
Oh yeah. I mean, again, it's like, it depends on the business, right? But like, you got to start looking up funnel, right? So many people are like looking at like output of like, yeah, this is what happened. This is what we have in late stage pipeline. Well, what's happening earlier stage pipeline? Do you have the right coverage? What's going on with like the marketing campaigns and initiatives? What are we forecasting, right? We know this event, here's what we're forecasting. Like, are we hitting that? Are we not? And looking at some of those projections too. And, forecasting just across the board, like we all do, revenue forecast, right? And we all probably do a crappy job of revenue forecasting. And again, I'll go back to like art and science, right? So much of it is like an exercise versus like true accuracy. But where are you doing, pipeline forecasting? Where are you taking and looking at like your meeting set and like moving up funnel and like making sure you're evaluating performance based on kind of what you're projecting to happen, right? Because those are ultimately the things that like cause an effect. And so how are you managing like the causes and the things that are really going to be what drive the effect, which ultimately are those, I'm talking like very much new business revenue here. There's a whole other side when we think about, retention and expansion, but like ultimately are getting that, revenue number and having like those up funnel conversations. Because ultimately, if you come to the table at the end of a quarter and you're like, oh yeah, we missed our goal, like here's what's happening, and like you didn't know you were going to miss your goal, like that's a huge red flag. Like don't bank on bluebirds.
That's or sales heroes. That's one of the GTM problems. We have a lot of questions that have come in here. Kate, we have an annual planning template for you. If you liked Molly, you like David too. David's going to go through his template. I'm sure, right, Pragya? Like that's that's to be expected. He has
that's what everybody loves.
It's
Excel.
Legit. I've seen it. Like, yeah, go to that session. David's awesome.
He's so thoughtful and he's so kind. How do you? So Johan has, with a rip here. How do you encourage a team to focus on the IQ solution and separate EQ from the outcomes to stay the course on efficient day-to-day RevOps? So you kind of touched this. I'm curious if you would expound any more on what you've said.
Yeah, I mean, one of like the biggest things, I guess I'm going to take like the soft approach on this, and like for me as like a leader that I really make a cognizant effort on is like transparency, right? And it goes back to like, if you have a sales rep who doesn't know how they got to that target and you're expecting them to hit the target, like you've immediately demotivated them and made them feel like it's not possible. And so when I think about like my team specifically, like generally, you know, we're asking a lot, right? Like generally RevOps, we've got a lot on our plate. There's a lot going on. Not to say like I'm asking my team to burn out. That's not what I mean by a lot, right? But like we're solving, you know, complex business problems. We're doing that across, you know, people, process, data, technology, right? Like there's a lot that goes into the decisions that we make and how they get executed. And if I can't have my team be like bought in on like why what they're doing matters, like I can't motivate them to like do their best job possible too. So I do think like, you know, transparency is so important, and like vulnerability as a leader too. There's sometimes that like the business makes a decision that I don't agree with, right? And like I'm not aligned to, and like my hope is like I'm always wrong, right? Like, and I don't get to be like I told you so. Not that I have an ego in that regard at all. But like I want to be transparent like with the team, especially like if I go to bat and advocate for resources and like don't get what I need. Like I and this is something I say with the CFO is like I need to understand why, and like I need to be able to communicate that down. And like you've got to be able to do that as a leader, or you're not going to retain talent. You're going to have demotivated employees, especially in the world of like cutting budgets, cutting headcount, cutting resources. Like you really need that buy-in, and at least that vulnerability for people to, you know, be okay being on the bus with you.
You're really only wrong with the bluebirds, right?
Right.
You're like, great.
Yeah.
You won this one.
I mean, like this is the last week of the quarter. I've got a few clients. We're praying for some bluebirds, right? So
we have a lot of good stuff here. You know, I'm jumping in, you know, so we were talking about like data, leveraging data insights. Is there a tech stack for data analysis that you prefer? And you came from the marketing ops world, so
yeah. I mean, I think everyone's like selfishly has like the tech stack that they prefer because they're comfortable with and they've used it and they like know it, right? I think it's less about probably like what the best tech stack is, but more like what does the business need and like what's going into the business. You know, and again, like my data is the byproduct of process. Like really doesn't matter the tools until you make sure you've got the right process to be able to support the data that you need, and figuring out how you use the technology to ultimately deliver on that. But, you know, generally, I'm not going to say like if you can do it in Excel like fast because you're a 5-person company and like that's you have 10 customers, like don't spend $1 million on your tech stack, right? Like logic. But I do think like when you start like, okay, so Salesforce CRM are not reporting tools, right? Like those are not where you're doing data analysis. Like those are point in time metrics, right? History saves for 18 months. Like you can't do a cohort analysis. You can't do all of the things that like actually need to go into producing business data for planning. And so what do businesses do? You know, you're generally best in class. You're pulling into a data warehouse. You know, like how you need to join not only your financial data with your sales data, with your marketing data to really be able to formulate that. Doesn't mean you have to have, you know, a visualization tool on top of it. Generally, that's nice to have, right? When you think about scale and not crashing.
Visualization is just hitting that button in Excel to make it a graph, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. And so I think like, you know, generally making sure you've got a good data infrastructure. The other thing is like having a I'm going to say data dictionary, but data pack, like an alignment on definitions is so key to, especially when you get between like business definitions and finance definitions. Having kind of that glossary is really valuable, because if you're talking about two different, and sometimes it's rightfully so, you're talking about two different metrics that might be the same term, whether you're looking at it from like a financial or business perspective. But having those definitions like outlined is also really important. I worked at a company, and every time product said customer, they meant something totally different than when the sales team or CS said customer because they didn't have a line definition. So as you can imagine, you go to like an OKR review and they're saying we have 500 customers and sales is saying we have 6,000, right? Like, it's like, why? Well, because we're looking at customer based on activity and you're looking at customer based on dollars. So when you think about, and I know we're talking tech stack, but like before you even think about the stack, think about what you're trying to measure and like what the definition is behind it. So you've got that right consistency. The other thing is publish those definitions, because you want people to understand what they're looking at. So when I go back to like my weekly meeting across go-to-market and my scorecard, the glossary is right in that deck. The glossary is not changing, but we have the glossary there. So if we have questions or somebody new is joining or things like that, like when we talk about net retention, like this is what goes into that calculation.
2024 is around the corner. Depending on who you ask, it's going to be better or it's going to be worse. Most people are saying the latter, believe it or not, and planning for that. Understanding that plans change, what kind of flexibility do you build in around KPIs? And from a managing up standpoint, how do you convey that to senior leadership who has to grow during this period?
Yeah,
do you even convey it, or is it usually like
you keep it in your back pocket?
No, mid-session you just change the execution, and then you're like, oh, quarter's over.
Or you just say like, hey, if we're not here 90 days in, we're going to have to start recalibrating H2 because my worst case scenario is happening.
Right. And that's tricky, right? Because like you think about like if you start changing, plan monthly, like you get into it and you're I'm going to say willy-nilly, and like you're doing that, like, what's the point of even having a plan at that point? Because you're likely making a panicked type adjustment that like you're not even letting things see through and come to fruition. I do think like, realistically, for general rule of thumb, every business is different though. Like you should be reviewing performance pacing, right, on that like monthly basis, but really reviewing like overall plan performance on the quarterly. And like if you're making those adjustments, like understanding kind of the trade-off, I think you should have a best and a worst case. And my bet is that there's some cushion in what that top line number is that's cascaded to the business versus what's going to your board. At least I hope there is, because that's probably signs of a really good CFO and good leader to kind of build some of that cushion in. But they're not going to tell you. I mean, don't take this for truth, right? But like they're probably not telling you what that cushion is. But my guess is you've got some cushion there.
David said like you always have to build like a 20% cushion. It's like everybody knows.
Yeah, I mean, it's always better to like exceed versus not achieve, right? And that's the same thing around like the KPIs that you're trying to set for probably your team to some extent is like, yeah, we, ultimately like here's what like the A goal is, here's what like the B goal is, here's what the C goal is, right? And like that C goal is probably like, really the realistic goal, but like you're still trying to like knock things out of the park. But and it's part of like what you want, it's the thing about like, what is it? Like something about like don't set like overachieve versus like underachieve, right? Like set yourself up for success versus like good failure. There's some saying around it, and I'm not getting there right now, but set realistic goals and like hopefully you can knock them out of the park, but also don't like set too cheap of goals from that regard too, where it's like you're not putting the full motivation in to get there.
And then let's take some questions from the audience. Like let's open this up. We have like 10 minutes left. I know Pragya has had some burning questions on her mind as well.
No, I mean,
as long as they're not about OKRs, I'm gonna need to not be stressed out about that anymore.
Can you share your template out of curiosity for your GTM scorecard and stuff? Like, is there something?
Yeah, for sure. And I do. I have a link.
Some of
I actually have a link somewhere on my LinkedIn bio. I'll surface that up where I put together like a sample RevOps roadmap for people because I kept getting asked all the time of like, what's my roadmap that I use? And I can probably even beef it up more with like project prioritization matrix and like pillars. So give me a bit and I can share something that the Rev Genius community can push out.
Let's go before you
I'm also
digital productize
dropping.
that.
I'm also dropping Molly's LinkedIn so that if anybody wants to connect, and yeah, please feel free to drop your LinkedIns as well so that the community here can also connect with each other. I think that would be nice.
Oh yeah, connect with each other on LinkedIn. Let's build our RevOps and strategic planning personal communities as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to start with questions since apparently the audience doesn't have any more questions. It seems.
They're
Or
quiet
we'll
right
just...
now. They were louder before.
Yeah, we'll wait for the questions.
Everyone's finding their LinkedIns,
Yeah.
which I love. I mean, I think, back to your point, Jared, like when do you pivot, right? Like pivot, like is really like understanding like the pacing and having those objectives set up front. Like anytime you're doing like champion challenger and hypothesis based testing, like setting the goal and like what the expectations are up front versus like after it's happened and saying, did it meet or did it not meet, helps to decide kind of like when you make those adjustments. Right. And, one of the things like I think a lot about is like, okay, if we're trying something new, we're doing something new, like how much do we invest in it? Right. Like what's our confidence level that this is actually going to like be successful? And if you're not sure on that, don't implement CPQ if like maybe you need to do some manual pricing for a bit because you still have to get things figured out.
But if you do, Deal Hub's a great option.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, don't implement. No, I won't say this publicly. If anyone wants my perspective on CPQ tools, you can just message me privately. I don't want to get blasted on some channel for my opinion on things. But when so think about like how confident like the business is in like this taking before you make the decision. And like this is just like general like expectations, right? Like if you can bike to work, don't buy a Lamborghini, right? Like especially if it's not in budget. So think about like those types of things like as you go into like implementation and like there's like, hey, here's the training wheel solution that we need before we need like the airplane solution. And like understand that like when you communicate that back, like if we see this take, like here's the investment we're going to need to make this scale, right? But because we're not sure if this works, we're going to allocate 2 hours a week of somebody's time to do this manually until we get to this result. And then we know we're going to need to spend 10 hours building this in X fashion so it can fully automate. And like that becomes like that prioritization piece. So try to like identify, I have a really gross analogy for this, but I guess it's not like people are probably not eating yet, but like I talk a lot about like scabs and scars is like when I think about what you're building is like, what are you doing that's like maybe gonna like scab and like it's not gonna permanently hurt something for the business and like leave a deficiency and like be horrible, but it just might be a little gross for a bit, but like it works. Versus like what are you doing that like if you don't do it right at the start, it's gonna scar. And like if you have to undo it, it's gonna be a nightmare. Like make the investment up front. I know that's like the grossest analogy ever, but it's the one that I feel like has resonated the most with me when I make like decisions of like how do I invest and like what's okay being manual versus what's okay, where we need to actually put the energy in because it's gonna cost us more in the long run.
On the flip side, I heard at least one of Molly's peers speak off the cuff saying like chopping stuff that like is redundant and like a vertically integrated thing, even though this might be like slightly better, just like chop, like nobody noticed.
Yeah, Tom's is like I use actually Tom has a good one of like glass and like rubber balls, which is a little bit less gross. I actually use the balls one a lot when I talk about like how I prioritize like my work-life balance. Like what are the things that like I'm okay dropping because it's okay, but what's going to shatter. So I've used that one before. Apparently I just like to discuss people though.
What else you got for us, Praga? Anything?
Yeah, I
And
would love to
audience,
remind.
we have so much stuff here in
Yeah,
6
but I
minutes.
think, Jared, we need to remind everybody about the session with Lisa, Molly, that you were talking about
Oh yeah.
at RevCon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Shout out to RevCon. Anyone who knows Lisa Kelly, or if you haven't had a chance to listen to Lisa speak, like hands down, like super excited. She's hosting like an Ask Me Anything session at RevCon, and like she is one of the people that I want to ask everything to. So like take the opportunity. I know RevGenius is going to start crowdsourcing questions, but like if you've got questions that you just want answered, like she's a goat. Like I don't know if it's appropriate to call people goats, but she's awesome.
Calling people anything positive is always appropriate.
Yes, that's right. Not a farm animal, like greatest of all time. And I mean, she's somebody like I have a meeting with her this week because I have a question. Like, and you know, she's somebody who's just got great perspective, great experience. Like, shoot out questions for that session. Like, I know you guys are gonna pull pieces, but like drop them into RevGenius Slack. Get them to the team, and join RevCon. I mean, I think this is the best go-to-market revenue team conference out there, and like if you look at the lineup, it's legit.
Thank you.
And then David's session tomorrow, for those of you who haven't registered for that one, getting into more of like the meat of sales and marketing planning.
Molly, do you have any last pieces of advice?
Oh man.
Or maybe some fails. What are some of the big fails that you've had while planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think like is Jared talking? Oh, maybe not. You're always gonna have like your plans. It's never gonna go to plan, right? Like you've got to be prepared for like you have a plan, you're gonna work a plan, but like planning is fluid, and like making sure you have that mindset, like it's not set in stone. Like you need to know when to adjust, when to be flexible, like when to make sure you're communicating. To the other thing, like that I again don't shock anybody, right? Like if you're not going to hit something or something's not going, like make sure that you are communicating that up and like communicating it early too. Like no one wants to get blindsided by like this not getting done because it's, you know, we weren't able to meet the goal or we had this blocker or this barrier, right? Like make sure like you're having those proper like status updates and upward motions of those types of things. Because I think not only like myself as a leader, like no, I don't want to be blindsided by my team because they were blocked by something that I didn't know was happening that I could have helped to mitigate or support. So like don't take it as failure. I think that's the hard thing is like humans, like we're like, man, we're gonna miss this goal, we suck, we're failures. Like that's not it. Generally it's like you weren't resourced properly. Like there are things that you need additional help and support or guidance on. There are questions like you couldn't answer or get the right inputs in. Like be okay having those conversations and like look at that as strength versus like weakness too, and like change your mindset on that. That's something like just professionally like I've had to work a lot on, and like I try to encourage teams on. It's like it's not failure, right? It's like actually really a strength that you're identifying this and communicating this early because you have, you know, the best interests of the business at heart, even if it means that like in the short term it might look like, you know, you weren't able to do what you said you could do. And there's a lot that I say I can do that I can't do and I have to ask for help for. So ask for the help when you need it. Oh, I can't hear you, Jared.
Neither can I.
Yep, he's probably saying something really profound and we're all lost on this.
Well, thank you so much, Molly.
Yeah,
and
thanks everyone for sitting on the soapbox with me. Thanks for having me, RevGenius. Really loved it.
Thank you, everyone. So we will send out, of course, the recorded sessions to everyone who was here and to everyone who missed it. Maybe not. But yes, thank you, everyone, for coming. And hopefully see some of you tomorrow. I dropped the link to David's session as well. And thank you once again, Molly.
Yep. Awesome.
Bye-bye.